The content in this podcast may not be suitable for all viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back. Just got the kids put down. Got some drinks poured right now. Ready to record episode 2. Welcome back, Ted.
Welcome back, Jake.
One thing I wanted to talk about was just kind of our intros into horror. When I was a kid, the very first movie that I had seen in horror was It. And I remember just watching it. I think it was on TV. Not really sure if it was a VHS at that time. But I just remember being a kid, maybe like 3 or 4 years old, and sitting kind of behind my couch, cowering, just watching this movie about this killer clown, which forever just created this horror of clowns for me, this giant fear.
It's not undeniable that he was creepy. Like, especially at that point.
It was just like, I think it was one of the scariest movies of its time. Like early 90s, everybody was afraid of clowns.
It still kind of gives me the heebie-jeebies when I watch it, honestly.
The new one is good, but I think the old one's better.
Yeah, I agree. You just can't compete with the classics.
What was yours?
Nightmare on Elm Street, the very first one. And I was like 5. And my brother was watching it, and he was 10 years older than me. Obviously, a huge age gap, and I probably shouldn't have been watching it. But I remember watching it and like having so much fascination. I wasn't like really scared. Yeah. I was more intrigued. Fascinated. Like, it kind of opened the door to like, oh, I really like these types of films. Like,
for me, they feel calming. Like, I don't really get scared of like horror movies. I think really like the last movie that actually like ever scared me was The Strangers.
Absolutely, because like that could happen.
Yeah, well, that was like the only time I remember watching that in our house when we were renting Jen's, and I just remember like watching it. And I think it was like the second time that the second time I turned it on, first full time that I actually watched it. But I remember having like a pocket knife in my pocket. Like, you were asleep. I remember you were pregnant and you were asleep on the couch. And I was sitting on the couch with a pocket knife, like in Gilbert, Arizona, over here thinking that...
Like, that was going to protect you.
That The Strangers was going to happen in like one of the safest cities in America.
And of all things, a pocket knife. That's great.
Yeah, it was like this small pocket knife I remember I got in the military. And it was like the most unorthodox. I think it was like a skinning knife or something, but it was really bad.
That's hilarious. Well, The Strangers definitely freaked me out. I would say Oculus got me really bad.
Ooh, I remember that.
Oculus. It still does. I cannot.
It was spooky. Like, I thought it was creepy.
It's
like,
eerie.
I got creeped out, and like there was a few jumps for me, but it wasn't like my go at the end of the day and be like afraid, like thinking about this movie all day. I was like, it's creepy in the moment.
Well, it depends on what you believe, though. Like, if you're a person that you believe that like there's life forms outside of ours, that movie really like messed me up. And I just remember they did a great job.
The statue scene was the one that like got me. It's like you're expecting it too, because there's like the sheet on like the bust head.
I still close my eyes during that scene.
It's just like, like she's pulling all the sheets off, and it's like you're waiting for it, and you know what's happening, and it always gets you every single time.
You know, another movie I think probably would have scared me when I was young. Not so much now. But you and I watched all the Terrifiers together because neither one of us had seen them. Yeah. Right? Because I definitely...
Like All Hallows even, yeah.
Yeah, I knew about it, but I obviously a few months ago you and I chipped into that. And I think like now I watch it and I'm like, I can like think back to a long time ago and I'm like, that would have freaked me out then. It doesn't freak me out now, but it's so different.
It was like, it felt more artsy to me than it was like scary. I think I remember for the longest time that I knew about it and I had heard that it was popular, but I remember that you told me about an ex of yours. It was like his favorite movie. And I was just like, yeah, I can't watch this. It was like my jealous stage.
You're like,
and I was like, I cannot watch this. I was like, I don't care how good it's going to be. I'm not going to watch this.
Oh no, I'm sorry he ruined that for you.
But with Freddy Krueger being your first, like I knew about Freddy growing up, but I don't think I actually watched my first like Freddy movie until like Freddy vs. Jason.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think
So,
I don't really remember watching any of the Freddy Krueger.
So that means that basically you really had a very vague idea of who he was, because that movie was like the ninth movie, I believe, and it briefly touched. But if you watch like obviously the first the whole franchise, like they very much go into depth about him and who he is.
I never got into the older movies, like the originals. I had kind of, again, chanced on Freddy vs. Jason because I was a big fan of Jason.
I do love
at that time.
movie.
But I think then some of the newer ones, I think it was like the one in 2009.
10. And this is controversial. Do you like it? Yes or no?
Well, I mean, it was one of my first experiences like fully with Freddy, especially as a teen when it came out.
True. So you didn't have an expectation because a lot of the horror community, they don't love, obviously, if they're fans of the initial franchise, they don't love the 2010
it's almost
remake.
Like
I can see why.
Wars.
I can see why. I really can, because like you really can't replace Robert Englund. You just can't. But I really do like the 2010 franchise. Not franchise, but single movie.
It's just like modern special effects, right?
Well, and they did make him really creepy, and I liked a lot of the actors and actresses. Like, I thought it was a pretty solid movie.
So the backstory of Freddy Krueger, explain more of that.
So basically, from what I know, his mom was a nun, and she was raped by over 100 psychopaths because she worked at a hospital.
Okay.
And so she got pregnant, and so she gave birth to Freddy. That became him. And that was kind of his origin story. And then they kind of touch briefly, and 2010 kind of touches on it more than maybe even some of the original movies. And I might be wrong to say that.
His time as an adult before he was...
Yeah, like about how he was married and he had a kid. And I was way younger when I first watched the franchise. So like a lot of attention to detail was probably absolutely missed. And you only know what you know when you're of age, but... they touch a little bit more on like how basically his wife went into the basement and found out and he was essentially a pedophile from what I interpret, right? And so he ended up getting apprehended.
Okay.
At some point.
Because he was like a rape or a child predator.
He was the springboard. Yeah, he was like a child predator, and he had like killed a bunch of people, and so he ended up being apprehended. And got released on a technicality. And apparently at some point they say it's because someone forgot to sign the search warrant. So
it was like a police mistake led to his release.
So enter into Freddy vs. Jason that you've seen. And you see in the beginning, the parents drive and he's in the boiler room and they go to kill him themselves. Like they're going to take vengeance because bad stuff had happened to their kids. Yeah. And I feel like I would do
the exact same thing.
Right.
Something happened to our kids and
right. So then
killer got out.
In all of this mix comes the dream demons, which are like, we can help you, but you have to let us in. And so he lets them in. And so here enters Freddy.
So the overall gist of his backstory, then, if I'm understanding it correctly, is pretty close to that of which the 2010 movie went over, right? So he started, but some of the older movies touch into his childhood.
Yes.
Which has to do with his mom being a nun, as well as him growing up eventually to become obsessed with children.
Right.
After that, he gets arrested after some series of events along the lines of child predation. Eventually gets arrested, right? And then after that, gets out on the technicality and then gets killed by the townspeople.
Yep. And then comes back to haunt their kids.
Got it.
So that is where you notice in all the iterations of the first movies, he's basically haunting the kids of the parents who killed him. And so I believe in Freddy, was it Freddy versus, no, it was the 2010 remake. They a little bit touch on how you see kind of throughout the movie that they're all piecing together that they knew each other, but they don't remember why they knew each other. And then all these kids are like, oh, this bad thing happened collectively to all of us.
He was the teacher, right?
No, he was actually, I think he was like the gardener or something. Or he worked on the power plant.
He was a member of the school faculty.
And had he worked somehow, right? Yeah, but he wasn't a teacher, no.
Okay. Are there any inspirations that actually came up from real life that created this character?
Yeah, so Wes Craven, who's a genius, who is responsible for Nightmare on Elm Street, he had read a news report about a family who escaped Cambodia and came to the U.S.
Okay.
And so this family had a son who was apparently dealing with PTSD, and obviously very, very bad PTSD or very complex PTSD, because
seems to be kind of like part of like a lot of killer theories and stories.
Yeah, and he was having disturbing nightmares and complaining to his parents that he was afraid to fall asleep. And so enter in our dream sequence, nightmare monster. Right. And so there was one point at which he stayed awake for several days trying to avoid sleep and eventually fell to his death.
Yeah, because when you go too long without sleeping, like, it can cause hallucinations, it can cause everything like that. So he fell to his death?
Well, not necessarily, but basically he stayed awake as long as he could, and then he fell asleep. And apparently after he fell asleep, his parents heard screams in the middle of the night and found him dead.
So they don't even know, like, how he died.
No, and actually at one point I had read, and whether this is true or false, I had read that this had been happening to several.
Oh, so it's not just this one isolated event.
Well, I don't know if Wes Craven knew about whether it was isolated or not, but apparently this nocturnal sudden death syndrome was happening with a lot of young adults in Cambodia. Like, they were just dying in their sleep, and a lot of them were complaining that they had nightmares. Okay.
So I'm assuming in that case, did they have any like shared news stories or anything like that going on? Was there any local legends?
No.
Or just became the inspiration for a horror movie?
Yeah, I guess it just became the inspiration, and really, thankfully, because those are some of the greatest classic horror films of all time.
Yeah, he's one of your classic villains.
He is absolutely the guy that I fall asleep to when I'm just like, this is my comfort movie. And everybody else is like, I'm going to watch Good Girl. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to go watch Nightmare on Elm Street. The other night, we were hanging out with your mom, and she said that you were Ghostface 2 years in a row for Halloween. And I know that you have a lot of brothers, and so she could be mistaking it. But I was thinking, if you were him 2 years in a row, you were fanboying.
Listen, I was a fanboy. But every kid in Halloween, like, there was at least 8 or 9 ghost faces out of like the bunch.
It was the easiest costume.
Yeah, it was one of the easiest ones, like the black robe and the mask.
And everybody loved it.
And then like your standard knife. But I was honestly surprised to actually find out a little bit about the inspiration of Ghostface and how actually close to when we were born these whole events happened.
Okay.
So without getting like too crazy into his backstory and his childhood and stuff like that, let's actually just jump into a little bit of more the fast forwarded version of who the Gainesville Ripper is. So Kevin Williamson based the Scream movies off of the Gainesville Ripper in Gainesville, Florida. The movie itself is based off of his college killings, which was a string of 5 murders, which happened at the University of Florida in Gainesville. So did your dad or anything mention anything about like these killings? Because they only happened in the 90s.
No, but I should ask him, because it's like...
They were brutal.
I don't know if you remember, but TVs were not quite as elaborate as they are now. So we definitely had the old box TVs.
It was just like standard local channels.
Yeah, so...
Did you have bunny ears on your TV?
Yeah. And he was in Denver, Colorado in the 90s.
So far from Florida.
But I'm sure he's heard about it. And, you know, it's interesting, since he did live through that period, you know, just the amount of serial killers he's lived through.
That man's lived through.
And... you know, he recalls...
Doesn't have a single story.
But he does. He remembers reading about the Zodiac in the newspaper.
Okay.
Because he was born in 1957, and the Zodiac was what, in the 1970s?
Yeah, Zodiac was 1970s.
Yeah. And so it was a big, you know, it was quite a bit of a news story, obviously, as he was pretty addicted to being front and center of the news. That was kind of the Zodiac's whole MO, so...
Yeah, I'm surprised, like, our parents didn't talk about that more.
It's interesting because if you're saying he only had, 5 victims?
So the Gainesville Ripper only had 5 victims.
Which is interesting because when we consider most serial killers, like, for example, we talked about Freddy Krueger and Random. He's obviously fictional, but he had 40 kills.
Yeah.
So he's a slasher. So when you say serial killer and it's 5, it's I don't know.
Seems a little different, not like your standard movie style.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he would actually break into these women's homes, and these were young women. We're talking college age, 18 to 25.
So kind of the same Ted Bundy kind of.
Yeah, that same kind of demographic. And they were always, the MO was mostly petite brunette women.
Looking after someone they loved, whether it was their mom, girlfriend.
No, they would be actually on their own. And they would be in their own homes in college dormitories.
And how would he get his way in?
So he was actually camping out in the woods, outside of this apartment, this
just
college housing.
Out?
Yeah, just scoping him out. He had ran away from Louisiana and actually fled to Florida and was living as a vagrant, basically a homeless person camping in a tent in the woods outside of this college dormitory.
Just imagine.
Just watching. Just
Why?
So he would watch and he would watch, and he would stalk these women down that probably reminded him of his wife in those senses, or at least what psychologists have told us that have delved into his story. But he would stalk these women, and then he would break into their homes with a screwdriver and a K-bar knife. So he'd break into their homes, he would tie them up with duct tape, tape their mouths shut, and then he would sexually assault these women and then stab them in the back. And the weirdest thing about it, too, is after he was done having his way, after he was done with the murder, he would clean them. And it was something that he probably learned from his dad being a cop, was kind of how to cover his trail. But he would clean them and then pose them in a sexual manner.
What do you think the psychology of his story is?
Again,
what would make you want to do that?
He had gotten away with the murders out in Louisiana and probably felt powerful and was upping his game. He was upping his next thing. He felt as a failure and wanted to prove himself that's something he was good at. He just got away with murder. He's good at murder.
So it's almost he's a perfectionist.
Yeah.
In the wrong way.
And he would just go to higher and higher heights each time. So the first murder was just cleaned and posed. The second murder actually happened the day after. And this one was actually a double murder. So he had watched another 2 women that were roommates. He broke into their home. He tied them both up because he knew one of them was sleeping in the bedroom, and he knew one of them was sleeping on the couch. And he apparently had chosen the one on the couch as the one he was going to sexually assault. So the first thing he did was he went to the woman in the room, tied her up in the same manner, and killed her. And then made his way into the living room where the couch was. And then he did the same thing. Taped her up, had his way with her, stabbed her in the back. And then he cleaned up their bodies and laid them again in a sexual manner. After the first 3 killings, so the first girl alone in her apartment, and then followed by the 2 girls, that's when the overall campus had actually started to hear about this. And so you have all this built up suspense, you have all this fear just kind of driving around. And that was one of the big things in Scream, was this fear of all these murders happening. Which it wasn't until then that it even got crazier. Because that's when he had broken into the house of Christina, where not only did he tie her up and stab her in the back and sexually assault her and all these things, but that's when he decapitated her and cleaned up the whole area and posed her head staring at her body. So now you have this extreme brutality just spreading throughout this college campus. And that's what they really build on in Scream, is more of the college murderer that's running around building all this fear, all this panic.
I will never forget the scene when the blonde-haired chick gets crushed by the garage.
Oh, yeah.
I
think I was always afraid of garages.
Yeah, I still to this day, if you ask me to manually open a garage,
now,
it's like
if it touches if it has any kind of resistance, it like bounces up.
Nope, I'm like, it could be the day. So it's such a classic, and yeah, it's interesting because they don't really go, like, they touch a little bit on the story behind the killer, but very, very briefly.
Well, even like some of the inspirations behind like how you always see him chasing him through the house and stuff like that. That I'm assuming that more of that inspiration came from his final 2 killings, which is where he had broken into the home of a woman that he thought lived alone. But little did he know was that she actually had a 6'2" roommate that was a male. That when he had broken into their home, he didn't know that this guy was going to be there. And so when he had snuck up on him and he stabbed him, the guy actually kind of came to life and started fighting back, which then caused the girl to kind of hear the ruckus, hear what was going on, and she hid in a bathroom and locked the door. And he broke down the door to tie her up, sexually assault her, and kill her, and then post her body. So that kind of goes more in line of that fear, like where everyone was being chased. You know, he was like breaking down the doors in the homes, chasing them throughout the entire house into the yard, you know, and then stabbing them on the lawn and then leaving a trophy. Because in Scream, he always just left the bodies. He didn't try to clean it up. He didn't try to hide his tracks. He just tried to build fear. So completely different, but I can see where the inspirations come from for Ghostface. And just kind of that fear built of these college students.
You know, it's interesting because thinking back to the original Scream movies, that a little bit was like Billy Loomis and the whole, so much emotion that hadn't been dealt with.
Yeah. And kind of like the I want it, someone to have it.
Yeah, and like someone has to pay the price.
Yeah. And I mean, it even got crazier because even the actual movie killings don't even like equate to what it eventually goes to.
Oh, absolutely. Well, just what you're explaining, like you're explaining,
it's brutal. It's like
sexual assault, and this may not be suitable for all listeners, but sexual assault and decapitation, and we don't see that in Scream. The idea that I get behind Scream and Ghostface was very much like this immature teenager kid who was angry and lashed out.
Yeah.
Which is so different from, I guess, the origin of like Freddy, where it's this grown man who's made really crappy decisions and is obviously like a super bad guy. Because why else would he choose to go the route of the dream demons? Like, you have to be obviously evil.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's interesting that that was the inspiration, yet it was so toned down and tamed from what the original story like really was.
Yeah, a lot of the older content for a lot of like horror movies, even like It. Yeah, like I actually went back and I had read the book, and it gets kind of weird. And there's some stuff that was definitely left out of the movie that makes sense.
Like what?
There is a child orgy scene in the book.
What?
Yeah,
Did you read it?
Yeah, after in the book of It, after they kill Pennywise and they have to escape, they're like stuck in the sewers and they can't get out. And to bring them all together, it's like a giant orgy. It's weird.
What?
Yeah, and it's like when there was memes popping up about it when they had announced It, because the whole remake was coming out and everyone's like, is the orgy scene going to be in there?
Are you going to actually follow the book?
Like how much, at what point do we draw the line?
I very much reminisce with our childhood in the fact that we lived through such an awesome time where so many of the prevalent like greatest horror films. You know, the Scream franchise,
huge, yeah.
Nightmare on Elm Street, you know, Halloween.
It was like the talk
Friday
of
the
it was the talk of the town or everything. Like school, everybody was dying about the new
I was
horror
obsessed
movies.
with Jeepers Creepers. That's another one of my very favorite films. I think I watched Dead End when I was like 11, and that pretty well messed me up because it took me I'm still I'm an adult and I don't think I understand.
Paranormal Activity was like huge for me. I loved it.
You know, The Exorcist is another great one. It's just a classic.
I've actually never seen The Exorcist.
We have to watch it. It's a classic. It's a classic. No matter how much you can't, you just have to get with it.
For me, like the big one, especially in high school, was like Paranormal Activity.
That was huge.
Because I had seen it with Doug, and I had snuck in because it was rated R.
Okay.
And it's like, I thought it was like, I was going to lose my mind. I was so anxious, but I wanted to watch this movie so bad because it's back in those days. I remember they used to like walk through and like check tickets. And always the goal was to like hide behind like some old couple or older couple and just act like you were their kid back in the day. But sitting through this movie and just the overall aspect, like everybody was getting super into it, and now everybody's like, to all like the crazy scenes that are going on. I remember there was like the reverberation every single time something happens in Paranormal Activity, and it's like everybody would be like, shut up, hey, get on the front. Like they would all be like that when those spots would happen, and there would be like the very beginnings of the movie, like nothing would go on. It'd be like keys jingling or something. But it would be like the most minor thing, and everyone's like, hey, shut up. Like I'm trying to watch the movie. And then it's like it goes to the next scene. But I feel like you don't get that anymore nowadays, like with modern horror.
No.
It just doesn't seem to really have that classic feel of these classic slashers.
I can't remember the last horror film I've watched recent that really had me feeling. Yeah, I mean, most of them are, I would say, decent.
Like I feel like I get like a little creeped out. Like I'd be like for like 5 seconds, but nothing really sits with me. Like Black Phone was one of
and some of them
ones that
start really well and then they end horrible. I'm like, what happened?
Barbarian
was like, you had such a good beginning. What is happening at the end?
God.
What is happening?
Barbarian. I remember. So remember how we watched that? I had seen it on like HBO, and I was just like, I never even watched like any of the trailers or anything. I had no idea what this movie was about. And so I started watching it. I was like, I remember seeing about it and hearing about how it's like a new release. And I should have taken that as like the hint that this movie was going to suck.
You should have checked Rotten Tomatoes.
But you and I had watched it, I had started watching it alone. And it was like when it was going on through like the Airbnb scene, like that whole section, I was just like, oh my God, this is so good. And I remember I told you, I was like, hey, babe, like, come watch this movie with me.
And I was so excited.
And we were so sold on it.
And in the beginning, I was like, this is actually really creepy.
It was so good. And then it took
such a wild turn.
It took that left turn. There was like baby bottle feeding.
Her nipples were everywhere. I don't know what was happening.
The jumping off the water tower scene.
She was naked. What was going on?
That was the first time in a long time that I think I've bursted out laughing.
She might as well have been wearing a diaper. It was so ridiculous.
Awful. That movie was so bad.
But such a great start. It was like, where...
It had such a great premise.
Where did it go wrong?
Left field. But
if they were to, but even that, right? So that's the new modern scary movie. If they were to make a modern slasher, what would you picture?
For a modern slasher, it would have to be something along the lines of like paranormal. It's got to be entities like that because like with modern technology, it's just
like people can't get behind a slasher anymore.
Slashers don't add up anymore. They don't.
Did people lose imagination?
Like I think The Strangers is good because The Strangers, like the creepiest thing about The Strangers is that it can happen to anybody, and the reason it happened to that family was because they were home. Like, so slashers like that.
Do you think people can't get behind the idea of fictional movies anymore?
Not like fictional movies, but more in the sense of like a long period of time where a span of murders happens, you know? And maybe like a few short, brutal killings. Like one of the movies within the, like, I think it was like the last 10 or 15 years, like The Collector. Do you remember that one?
That one was creepy.
Did you even finish it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember seeing the trailers for that movie, and they like introduced it more as like an action horror. Because it was supposed to be like, oh, what happens like when a thief breaks into a house?
It was more like a traumatizing horror.
It was like, what happens when the thief breaks into a house? And it's like, oh wait, the serial killer's already there. And it's just like, okay, so we have an action movie or a horror movie. But I don't think a lot of modern audiences are really going to collect behind a new slasher. It's just too hard to beat the classics. You know, you're not going to make somebody that's going to replace Freddy Krueger. You're not going to replace Jason. You're not going to replace Ghostface. Or even like Chucky. Like even some of the new Chuckies have been pretty bad.
Yeah.
But it's like, so you're not going to replace those classics, which is why I think we tend to see a lot more of the paranormal, more of like the supernatural, paranormal, more alien type horror movies, or like creatures. But you just can't beat those classics. But that about wraps up this episode. But catch us on all of our socials. Until next time, I'm Jake.
I'm Tay.
And thanks for tuning in.